February 12, 1940, 2:47 a.m. North Sea, 85 miles east of Aberdeen. The HMS Somali pitched violently in the black water, her bow cutting through 18-foot swells that exploded across her forward gun turrets in sheets of freezing spray. Lieutenant Commander Jack Rushbrook gripped the bridge rail, salt stinging his eyes as he strained to see anything beyond the destroyer's bow, anything at all. The darkness was absolute. No moon. No stars. Just the howling wind and the roar of the sea. Still nothing on the RDF, sir. Petty Officer Davies shouted from the cramped compartment behind the bridge, his voice barely audible over the storm. RDF radio direction finding the clumsy name the Royal Navy used for what the boffins called radar. The device was supposed to detect enemy aircraft and ships by bouncing radio waves off them. Supposed to. Rushbrook checked his watch again. The convoy was out there, some 12 merchant ships carrying fuel oil from America, spread across miles of ocean, each one a floating bomb waiting for a U-boat's torpedo. His destroyer and 2 corvettes were meant to shepherd them through these waters, but shepherding required seeing your flock. And tonight, in this storm, with cloud cover so thick it pressed down like a coffin lid, they were all blind. RDF shows something at 9 miles, bearing 045, Davies called out again. Could be one of ours. Could be a U-boat on the surface. Could be bloody Neptune's chariot for all I can tell from this fuzzy mess, sir. That was the problem. Britain's chain home radar stations standing sentinel along the coast were magnificent towering 300-foot masts that could detect German bomber formations from over 100 miles away. They had given fighter command the precious minutes needed to scramble Spitfires and Hurricanes during the early months of the war. They were, in their way, England's invisible shield. But chain home operated on wavelengths measured in meters long, lazy radio waves that could spot large aircraft formations at great distances but couldn't tell you much else. They certainly couldn't be mounted on ships or aircraft. They were too large, too power-hungry, too imprecise. And the ship-mounted sets like the one aboard Somali, they were even worse, primitive adaptations that painted such broad, fuzzy pictures on their cathode screens that distinguishing friend from foe, ship from sea clutter, was more art than science. Rushbrook ducked inside the bridge and leaned over Davies's shoulder. The RDF screen glowed green in the darkness, a circular display marked with range rings. A pale smear of light appeared and disappeared in the upper right quadrant with each sweep of the display. Something that might be metal, might be a wave, might be anything. What's our closest merchantman? Rushbrook asked. The Robert E. Peary should be 8 miles off our starboard bow, sir. But in this weather. Davies didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. In this weather, the convoy had probably scattered like leaves. Each merchant captain was steering blind, trying to maintain course and speed while praying they didn't collide with one of their own. The sound reached them before the RDF did a dull, muffled crump that traveled through the water and the ship's hull before it reached their ears through the air. Rushbrook was moving before his conscious mind registered what it meant. Sound action stations. All ahead full. Helm, come right to 045. Somali's engines roared as she surged forward, her stern squatting down as her propellers bit into the heavy seas. Men poured onto the deck, some still fastening their life jackets, rushing to man the guns and depth charge racks. The destroyer climbed and dove through the swells, hurling spray high enough to drench the forward superstructure with each plunge. There! The lookout's cry cut through the wind. A column of flame had appeared in the darkness ahead, orange and yellow fire boiling up from the sea, painting the undersides of the clouds with hellish light. One of the merchantmen. Oil fires burned on the water around the stricken ship, and in their glow, Rushbrook could see her stern rising as her bow went down. RDF contact, bearing 347, range 2,000 yards. Davies's voice carried an edge of panic. Could be the U-boat, sir, but I'm showing 3, maybe 4 contacts in that sector. It's all muddled with the wreckage and the dash. Fire star shell, 40 degrees off the port bow. Rushbrook commanded. The order was relayed, and seconds later, a 4-inch gun barked. High above, a parachute flare burst into brilliant white light, swinging beneath its parachute, illuminating a circle of churning sea, but the U-boat, if it was there, remained invisible. Submerged. Safe in the dark water while men died in the flames above. Somali charged through the burning oil, her hull heating from the proximity of the flames. Rushbrook could see men in the water, now tiny figures clinging to debris, arms waving desperately. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while the U-boat might still be lurking nearby, ready to put a torpedo into his destroyer the moment she slowed to pick up survivors. Depth charges ready, sir. But where? Where do you drop depth charges when your radar can't tell you if that contact is a submarine, a piece of wreckage, a whale, or a ghost signal bouncing off a temperature layer? Rushbrook had fought this battle before everyone in the Royal Navy had fought this battle. You made your best guess, said a prayer, and rolled the drums of explosive off your stern, hoping that somewhere in the black depths below, 300 pounds of amatol would find its mark. They never did. Not often enough. Not nearly often enough. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a grey sea littered with debris. They pulled 43 men from the water. The Robert E. Peary was gone, along with her cargo of 12,000 tons of fuel that Britain desperately needed to keep her fighters in the air, her ships at sea, her trucks and tanks moving. The U-boat had escaped, of course. It always did. Somewhere out there, a German commander was updating his kill board while his crew celebrated with ersatz coffee and the last of their chocolate ration. Back in port at Scapa Flow 2 days later, Rushbrook filed his action report. In the section marked Equipment Performance, he wrote simply, RDF of limited utility in surface engagement. Unable to distinguish targets or provide firing solution. It was the same report filed by dozens of other captains, week after week, as the U-boat strangled Britain's supply lines one ship at a time. What Rushbrook didn't know what nobody in the fleet knew was that at that very moment, 500 miles to the south, two young physicists at Birmingham University had just solved the problem that had nearly gotten him killed. Their solution sat on a laboratory bench, no larger than a honeycomb, cooled by a small fan. It was called a cavity magnetron, and it was generating microwaves at a power level that shouldn't have been possible, that every textbook said was impossible. When Professor Marcus Oliphant first saw the demonstration, watching ice form on a block of metal placed in front of the device, he understood immediately what it meant. It meant radar could finally see clearly. It meant wavelengths measured in centimeters instead of meters. It meant resolution sharp enough to detect a submarine's periscope cutting through the waves, sharp enough to guide a night fighter onto a bomber's tail in pitch darkness, sharp enough to map a coastline from an aircraft or spot a human being on a beach. It meant Britain had just invented the technology that would win the war. But Britain was an island under siege, with Germany's Wehrmacht camped across the Channel and Luftwaffe bombers pounding her cities every night. She had brilliant scientists but limited manufacturing capacity. She had the invention but not the industrial might to mass-produce it in the quantities needed to equip every ship, every aircraft, every gun director that could use it. Britain needed help. And that meant Britain needed America. The question was, how do you convince the Americans still neutral, still distant from the war, still watching from across the Atlantic to commit their vast industrial resources to building a British invention? How do you persuade them that this strange copper cylinder, this cavity magnetron, was worth their time and money? The answer, it turned out, was audacious beyond measure. You put your most valuable military secrets in a box, you send your brightest minds across an ocean infested with U-boats, and you give it all away. Everything. For free. In Whitehall, in the rooms where Britain's survival was planned and plotted, they were about to authorize what historian James Finney Baxter would later call the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. But first, they had to build enough political courage to give away the crown jewels of British science to a nation that might never enter the war at all. August 29, 1940. 10, Downing Street, London. 11:15 a.m. The windows of the cabinet room had been covered with blackout curtains since dawn, though it was mid-morning a precaution after a German bomber had dropped its payload on the Treasury building just 3 streets away the night before. Winston Churchill sat at the head of the long table, a smouldering cigar clamped between his teeth, reading a memo that would have seemed insane if the world hadn't already gone mad. You want to give them everything. Churchill's voice rumbled through the haze of tobacco smoke. The magnetron, the proximity fuse, the jet engine designs, the plastic explosives, you propose to hand the Americans our entire war chest of secrets, and you expect nothing in return. Sir Henry Tizard stood at the opposite end of the table, a slight, grey-haired man of 54 who looked more like a country schoolmaster than the chairman of the Aeronautical Research Committee. But behind his wire-rimmed spectacles was one of the sharpest scientific minds in Britain, and behind his mild demeanour was a man who understood that Britain's survival depended on winning an argument with the most stubborn man in England. "Prime Minister, we expect America's industrial capacity in return," Tizard said calmly. "We have the brains. They have the factories. We have 12 months of scientific advancement. They have 12,000 machine tools. We are asking them to manufacture weapons we've invented but cannot build in sufficient quantity. We're drowning in blueprints, Prime Minister, but we're starving for production lines." Churchill grunted, flipping through the pages. The list of technologies proposed for sharing was staggering: jet propulsion, rocket weaponry, plastic armor, chemical warfare defenses, and dozens more. But the crown jewel item that had prompted this emergency meeting was the cavity magnetron. "Explain this magnetron business to me again," Churchill commanded. "In English, not boffin speak." Professor Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's scientific advisor, cleared his throat. "Our current radar uses long radio waves several meters from peak to peak. The magnetron generates microwave waves just a few centimeters long. Shorter waves mean sharper pictures. Instead of seeing a blurry blob that might be an aircraft, we see the aircraft itself. We see its size, its altitude, its exact position. We can put this device in a night fighter and have it hunt bombers in complete darkness. We can mount it on a ship and detect a submarine's periscope at 2 miles. We can dash." Yes, I grasp the significance," Churchill interrupted. "Which is precisely why I'm reluctant to hand it over to the Americans on a silver platter. What if they refuse to share their manufacturing output with us? What if they take our invention, patent it as their own, and sell it back to us at American prices?" "Then we lose anyway," Tizard said bluntly. "Prime Minister, we're losing the Atlantic. Last month, U-boats sank 56 merchant ships. 56. Our convoys are sailing blind, and our escorts can't find submarines even when they know they're there. We need hundreds thousands of centimetric radar sets to equip our ships and coastal aircraft. We can build perhaps a few dozen per month with our current capacity. The Americans could build hundreds per week if they commit to it." Churchill rose from his chair and moved to the covered windows, peeling back the blackout curtain just enough to look out at the damaged city beyond. Bomb craters pockmarked St. James's Park. The morning's reports had listed another 300 civilian casualties from the previous night's raid. The Luftwaffe was coming every night now, and Britain's night fighters were nearly useless, forced to rely on searchlights and luck to find the bombers in the darkness. "When would you leave?" Churchill asked quietly. "As soon as possible. The Atlantic crossing becomes more dangerous every week. We're proposing a small team, myself, several military liaisons, and technical experts for each technology we're sharing. We'll carry prototypes and specifications. The magnetron itself will travel in a special case, guarded at all times." "Who invented this miracle device?" Churchill turned back to face the room. "2 physicists at Birmingham University," Lindemann said, consulting his notes. "John Randall and Harry Boot. They're both in their 20s. Randall was actually studying for his PhD when war broke out. They built the first working magnetron in February, using equipment scrounged from the university's physics laboratory." "I want to meet them," Churchill said suddenly. "Anyone who invents something this valuable deserves a conversation with the Prime Minister. Arrange it, Lindemann." "Prime Minister, they're rather occupied with improving the design," Lindemann began, but Churchill waved him off. "Tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. Here. I won't send British secrets across an ocean without looking in the eyes of the men who created them." September 4th, 1940. Birmingham University. Physics Department. John Randall hunched over the workbench, making microscopic adjustments to the copper cylinder in front of him. At 28, he had dark hair that tended to fall across his forehead when he worked, which was nearly always. The laboratory smelled of hot metal and ozone, and the windows had been painted black according to blackout regulations, making it feel like working in a cave. "The Prime Minister wants to see us," Harry Boot announced, bursting through the laboratory door with a telegram in his hand. Boot was 2 years younger, stockier, with an enthusiasm that made him seem even younger. Tomorrow. London. 10 Downing Street. Randall didn't look up from his work. Tell him we're busy. We've got the power output up to 15 kilowatts, but the frequency drift is still unacceptable. If we can't stabilize the dash. John. Boots' voice was suddenly serious. The Prime Minister. Churchill himself. Tomorrow. Randall finally looked up, pushing his hair back. You're serious? Dead serious. They're sending a car for us at dawn. We're to bring the magnetron prototype and be prepared to explain how it works. Apparently, he's approved some sort of mission to America, and our device is the centerpiece. The magnetron sitting between them on the workbench didn't look like much. A copper cylinder about the size of a grapefruit, with 8 cavities machined into its circumference around a central cathode. It had taken them 6 months of trial and error to make it work, 6 months of burning through university research funds and scrounging copper from wherever they could find it. The breakthrough had come in February, when they'd managed to generate microwave radiation at power levels hundreds of times greater than anyone thought possible. The secret was elegant. Electrons spiraled around a magnetic field inside the cylinder, passing through the cavities in a synchronized dance that generated electromagnetic radiation. Each cavity resonated at the same frequency, amplifying the effect. It was like having 8 tuning forks all singing the same note simultaneously, except instead of sound waves, it produced microwaves powerful enough to cook food or melt metal or, more usefully, bounce off distant objects and return as a detectable echo. They want to give it to America? Randall asked. Apparently. Professor Oliphant explained it to me last week. Britain can't produce enough sets to make a difference in the war. America has the manufacturing capacity but doesn't have the technology. So we're trading one for the other. Randall carefully packed the magnetron into its protective case, a lead-lined box that would prevent accidental exposure to the microwaves it could generate. His hands shook slightly. This device, this thing he and Boot had built from spare parts and guesswork, was apparently valuable enough to determine the outcome of the war. We should probably practice explaining this without using the word resonant, Boot said. I hear Churchill doesn't care for technical jargon. September 5, 1940. 10 Downing Street. 9 a.m. The cabinet room seemed smaller than Randall had imagined, and much smokier. Churchill sat in his customary chair, already working through his second cigar of the morning, studying the young physicists with the keen interest of a man who collected useful people the way others collected stamps. Show me, Churchill commanded without preamble. Randall carefully removed the magnetron from its case, setting it on a velvet cloth in the center of the table. In the morning light filtering through the windows, the copper gleamed dully, the 8 cavities visible as dark holes around the circumference. Prime Minister, this device generates electromagnetic radiation at a wavelength of approximately 10 centimeters, Randall began. When connected to an antenna and powered by dash. In English, young man. Pretend I'm a particularly dim infantryman. Boot stepped in. Sir, imagine shouting in a cave and listening for the echo. The echo tells you how far away the cave wall is. Now imagine shouting with a very high-pitched voice so high that instead of hearing hello, you hear hello with perfect clarity, and you can tell not just that there's a wall, but exactly what shape it is, whether it's rough or smooth, even if there's a crack in it. This device does that with radio waves. It shouts very precisely, and it hears very precisely. Churchill leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the copper cylinder. And this allows us to see U-boat periscopes. In good conditions. Yes, sir. At distances up to several miles. And more importantly, it allows us to map the ocean surface with enough resolution to distinguish a submarine conning tower from a wave. We can put these in aircraft for hunting submarines, in ships for navigation and gunnery, in ground stations for directing fighters. Anywhere we need to see in the dark or through clouds. Why didn't we have this 2 years ago? Churchill asked. Because nobody thought it was possible, sir, Randall said quietly. The mathematics suggested it couldn't be done, that you couldn't generate sufficient power at these wavelengths. We only tried because we didn't know it was supposed to be impossible. Churchill's expression softened slightly, the ghost of a smile appearing beneath his mustache. There's a valuable lesson there. Very well. Tizard, You have my authorization for your mission. Take this thing to America. Make them understand its value. Get them to build it in quantities we cannot. But his voice hardened, make them understand that this is a gift from one ally to another, and that we expect them to remember it when this war is over. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. But as Randall carefully packed the magnetron back into its case, Churchill called out, "Dr. Randall. Dr. Boot. You may have just saved England. I thought you should know that." September 11th, 1940. Liverpool docks. 6:30 p.m. The SS Duchess of Richmond sat low in the water, her holds crammed with cargo and her decks crowded with passengers, businessmen, diplomats, refugees, and now, unexpectedly, a scientific mission carrying Britain's most valuable military secrets. She was painted in wartime grey, her name and markings obscured, and she would sail without escort once she cleared Irish waters. The Atlantic crossing would take 10 days, possibly more, through waters where U-boats hunted in wolf packs. Henry Tizard stood on the dock, watching his team board, each man carrying a single suitcase and a burden of responsibility that weighed far more. There were 8 of them in total: Tizard himself, 3 military officers specializing in radar and gunnery, 2 aeronautical engineers, a chemical weapons expert, and Eddie Bowen, a radar specialist from the telecommunications research establishment who had been designated as the guardian of the magnetron. Bowen carried an unremarkable black metal box, roughly the size of a briefcase, handcuffed to his wrist. Inside, packed in foam and surrounded by lead shielding, was the cavity magnetron, or rather, a magnetron, since Randall and Boot had managed to produce 3 working units in the past month. This was designated Unit Number 12, the most reliable of the batch. "Remember," Tizard said quietly to Bowen as they prepared to board, "if we're attacked by a U-boat, if the ship begins to sink, your first priority is to throw that box overboard. We cannot allow it to fall into German hands. Better it sits on the ocean floor than ends up in Berlin." Bowen nodded, his young face pale. He was 26 years old, and his government had just ordered him to guard a secret valuable enough to change the course of history or to destroy it rather than let the enemy capture it. The Duchess of Richmond sailed on the evening tide, slipping out of Liverpool harbour as the sun set behind the damaged city. Tizard stood at the stern rail, watching Britain recede into the distance. Somewhere behind them, in London, Churchill was preparing for another night of bombing. Somewhere ahead, in the Atlantic darkness, U-boats prowled. And in Bowen's cabin, handcuffed to the young scientist's wrist, a small black box held the key to Allied victory if they could survive the crossing. September 19th, 1940. Mid-Atlantic, 800 miles east of Newfoundland. 3:42 a.m. The explosion threw Eddie Bowen from his bunk onto the cabin floor. For a moment, still tangled in blankets and disoriented by sleep, he couldn't process what was happening. Then the ship's alarm bells began clanging, and he heard the sound every merchant sailor dreaded: the high-pitched screech of tearing metal and the rush of water flooding into compromised compartments. His hand shot to his wrist. The handcuff was still there. The black box was still secured to the chain. He grabbed his life jacket with his free hand and stumbled into the passageway, where passengers were already emerging from cabins in various states of panic and undress. "U-boat! U-boat!" someone was shouting. "Torpedo hit amidships! All hands to boat stations!" Bowen fought his way through the crowd toward the upper deck, the metal box banging against his leg with each step. The ship was listing. He could feel it in the angle of the floor beneath his feet, in the way people had to lean left to walk straight. The Duchess of Richmond had been hit, and she was taking on water fast. On deck, chaos reigned. Lifeboats were being lowered on their davits, but the ship's list made the process dangerous. Boats on the starboard side hung too far from the rail, while those on port scraped against the hull. Passengers crowded around each boat, some shoving, some frozen in terror. The Atlantic stretched away in all directions, black and infinite under a moonless sky. Tizard appeared at Bowen's elbow, his face grim. "How bad?" "Don't know yet, sir. We're listing, but we're not going down immediately." "The magnetron." Bowen held up his handcuffed wrist. "Still secured." A naval officer Bowen didn't recognize pushed through the crowd toward them. "Sir Henry Tizard? Captain's compliments, and he says the torpedo missed the engine room. We're making water, but the pumps are holding." He thinks we can stay afloat if the U-boat doesn't fire again. Why would it not fire again? Tizard asked. Might have been a single torpedo. U-boats often fire one as a warning shot before surfacing to sink a target with deck guns. Saves torpedoes. Or. The officer hesitated. Or they might have more boats hunting us, and they're waiting to see if we launch lifeboats before they move in. It was a hideous calculus. Stay on a damaged ship that might sink at any moment, or take to lifeboats in the middle of the Atlantic where U-boats could surface and machine gun survivors at will. Both choices ended in death if luck ran out. We stay aboard, Tizard decided. Signal the captain. The Tizard mission stays with the ship. The next 3 hours were the longest of Bowen's life. The ship's pumps fought the incoming water to a standstill. Damage control parties shored up the breached bulkheads with timber and mattresses. The passengers slowly returned to their cabins or huddled in the lounges, knowing that sleep was impossible. And everyone waited for the second torpedo that never came. By dawn, the U-boat was gone, either satisfied with one damaged ship, or called away to another target, or simply unable to find them in the darkness. The Duchess of Richmond limped northwest at 8 knots, listing 5 degrees to port, her crew manning the pumps in shifts while the captain radioed ahead to Halifax for assistance. Bowen sat in his cabin, the black box beside him on the bunk, his hand still cuffed to its handle. He was shaking, had been shaking since the alarm bells stopped, but he didn't unchain himself. Somewhere below, in the flooded compartments, seawater was sloshing against bulkheads that groaned with every swell. And in this box, a copper cylinder containing Britain's best hope continued its journey to America. They reached Halifax 6 days late, and from there took a train to Washington, D.C., arriving on September 29th with their precious cargo intact but their nerves shattered by the crossing. October 6, 1940. National Bureau of Standards, Washington, D.C. 2:15 p.m. The conference room was crowded with America's scientific elite, though most of them had been told only that British colleagues would be presenting recent developments in radio technology. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would revolutionize warfare. Alfred Loomis sat in the front row, his Wall Street fortune and his private physics laboratory having earned him a position as an advisor to the government on scientific matters. Beside him sat Ernest Lawrence from Berkeley, inventor of the cyclotron. Behind them, representatives from MIT, Bell Labs, General Electric, RCA, men whose decisions could mobilize American industry or leave British innovations gathering dust. Henry Tizard stood at the front of the room beside a covered table. Eddie Bowen, still looking exhausted from the Atlantic crossing, stood at the door with the black box, no longer handcuffed but still guarding it jealously. "Gentlemen," Tizard began, his voice carrying the measured authority of a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times during the voyage, "Britain is fighting for her survival. We need America's help, not your soldiers, not yet, but your factories, your manufacturing capacity, your industrial genius. In return, we are prepared to share the results of British scientific research, without restriction or reservation." He nodded to Bowen, who brought the black box forward and set it on the table. Tizard opened it carefully, removing the protective foam to reveal the cavity magnetron nestled inside. "This is a device we call the cavity magnetron," Tizard continued, lifting it out. In the fluorescent lighting of the conference room, the copper cylinder looked almost mundane, a piece of plumbing, perhaps, or a component from some industrial machine. "It generates microwave radiation at power levels approximately 100 times greater than any previous device. It will allow us to build radar systems with resolution measured in feet rather than miles." He set the magnetron on the table and stepped back. "I'm going to demonstrate its capabilities now. Mr. Bowen, if you would." Bowen had already set up the demonstration equipment, a simple microwave transmitter powered by a portable generator, with the magnetron as its heart. He flipped a switch, and a fan began to cool the device. Then he activated the magnetron itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Bowen placed a beaker of water in front of the device, in the path of the invisible microwave beam. Within seconds, the water began to steam. Within a minute, it was boiling violently, bubbles erupting from the superheated liquid. The American scientists leaned forward, murmuring to each other. Loomis stood up, walking closer to examine the magnetron. "How much power?" he asked sharply. 10 kilowatts at 10 centimeters wavelength," Tizard replied. "We've achieved 15 kilowatts in laboratory conditions." The murmuring grew louder. Loomis turned to look at Ernest Lawrence, and something passed between them, a look of recognition, of understanding. They both knew what this meant. "May I see the interior?" Loomis asked. Tizard produced technical drawings from his briefcase, spreading them on the table. The Americans crowded around, studying the elegant simplicity of the design, the 8 resonant cavities, the magnetic field configuration, the cathode arrangement. It was brilliant in its simplicity, revolutionary in its execution. "Gentlemen," Tizard said quietly into the stunned silence, "this device makes it possible to see a submarine periscope from an aircraft at night, in a storm. It makes it possible to guide a fighter onto a bomber's tail in complete darkness. It makes it possible to aim anti-aircraft guns with precision even when the target is invisible to the human eye. It is, quite possibly, the most important military technology Britain has developed in this war." He paused, letting that sink in. "And we are giving it to you. The complete specifications, the manufacturing techniques, the theoretical basis, everything. We ask only that you build it. Build it in quantities we cannot achieve. Build it and help us put it on every ship, every aircraft, every gun director that needs it." A hand rose from the back of the room. "Sir Henry, what are your terms? Patent rights, licensing fees, production quotas, what does Britain require in return?" Tizard's answer was simple: nothing. "We require nothing except that you build it and share the output with us. This is a gift from one ally to another, though I know America is not yet formally our ally. Consider it an investment in your own future defense, if you prefer. Because if Britain falls, if our island is invaded, the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine will possess this technology. And then, gentlemen, it will be aimed at you." Alfred Loomis stepped forward. "Sir Henry, I need to make some telephone calls. Can you and your team remain in Washington for another week?" "We can remain as long as necessary." "Good. Because if I'm right about what I'm seeing here, we're going to need to create an entirely new laboratory to develop this. We're going to need MIT's involvement, Bell Labs' manufacturing expertise, and about $10 million in funding from the government. And we're going to need to move very, very quickly." He picked up the magnetron, turning it over in his hands, studying it from every angle. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "You've just handed us the key to winning the war at sea and in the air." October 12, 1940. MIT, Cambridge, Massachusetts. 11 a.m. The meeting had been called with 48 hours' notice, bringing together the presidents of MIT, Harvard, and several other universities, along with representatives from the military and defense contractors. They gathered in MIT's faculty club, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes while Tizard repeated his presentation, this time with more technical details for an audience that could appreciate them. Professor Lee Dubridge from the University of Rochester raised his hand. "Sir Henry, implementing this will require an unprecedented level of coordination between universities, military labs, and private industry. The typical academic research model won't work. We can't have 3 different universities each inventing their own version of a magnetron radar set. We need centralized direction, shared resources, standardized designs." "I agree entirely," Tizard replied. "In Britain, we found that wartime research requires abandoning normal academic protocols. Information must be shared freely and immediately. Ego must be set aside in favor of results." Alfred Loomis stood. "I propose we create a new laboratory specifically for microwave radar development. Call it the Radiation Laboratory Rad Lab for short. House it here at MIT. Staff it with the best physicists we can recruit from universities across the country. Give it military funding but civilian operation. Make it a crash program with a single goal: turn this British magnetron into working radar systems as quickly as possible." "Who would run such a laboratory?" someone asked. "Lee Dubridge," Loomis said without hesitation. "If he'll do it." Dubridge looked startled, but nodded slowly. "If MIT will have us, I'll do it. But we'll need people, lots of people. Every physics PhD in the country who isn't already working on something more important." "There is nothing more important than this," Loomis said flatly. "Gentlemen, Let me be blunt. The British have handed us a technology that will take years for the Germans to duplicate independently. They've given us a head start measured in precious months, maybe the only head start we'll get in this war. If we move quickly, we can have operational radar sets in production before Germany even understands what's possible. That advantage could save thousands of lives. He turned to Tizard. Sir Henry, you need to leave your technical team here. All of them. We need Bowen and the others to train our people, to answer questions, to help us avoid the mistakes you made during your development process. Tizard nodded. They'll stay as long as you need them. Britain can spare a few scientists if it means gaining thousands of radar sets. The vote was unanimous. The radiation laboratory would be established immediately, with initial funding of $2 million and a mandate to recruit 300 scientists and engineers within 3 months. MIT would provide the Space Building 20, a hastily constructed wooden structure meant to be temporary. Nobody present knew that the temporary rad lab would eventually employ 4,000 people and become the single most important military research laboratory of the war. Eddie Bowen sat in the back of the room, listening to Americans plan the industrial mobilization of his invention, or rather, Randall and Boots' invention, which he had merely carried across the Atlantic. He thought about the torpedo that had nearly sent the magnetron to the ocean floor, about the U-boat commander who had unknowingly come within seconds of changing the course of history. After the meeting, Loomis pulled him aside. Mr. Bowen, I want you to understand something. The device you brought us, that magnetron, we're going to turn it into an American industry. We're going to manufacture it by the thousands. We're going to make it smaller, more powerful, more reliable. We're going to put it in places you haven't even imagined yet. And when this war is over, the technology that started in a Birmingham laboratory is going to change the world. Sir, Bowen said quietly, we just want it to help win the war. Oh, it will, Loomis promised. Believe me, Mr. Bowen, it will. October 30th, 1940. Building 20, MIT. First day of operations. The radiation laboratory opened its doors with a staff of 30 people crammed into offices that still smelled of fresh paint and sawdust. Lee Dubridge had left his comfortable position at Rochester to run a facility that didn't yet have working telephones or sufficient electrical outlets. His first team of physicists included men who would later win Nobel Prizes, though none of them knew it yet. They knew only that they'd been pulled from their universities and told to build radar sets using a British invention that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The original cavity magnetron unit number 12, still the same one Eddie Bowen had carried across the Atlantic, sat in a place of honor in the main laboratory, mounted in a display case. Around it, on whiteboards and in notebooks and in the minds of America's brightest scientists, the work began. Within a month, the Rad Lab had produced its first American-made magnetron, slightly improved over the British design. Within 2 months, they had designed their first complete radar system, the AI-10 Airborne Intercept Radar, meant to guide night fighters onto German bombers. Within 3 months, they had contracts with manufacturers to begin mass production. The cascade had begun. British invention, American industry, merged into a weapon that would hunt U-boats in the Atlantic, guide bombers over Germany, detect Japanese aircraft in the Pacific, and ultimately help win a war that would claim 60 million lives before it ended. And it had all started with 2 young physicists in Birmingham who didn't know something was impossible, and a gift freely given by a nation that had no choice but to trust its most valuable secret to an ally that wasn't yet ready to fight. March 15, 1943. HMS Starling, North Atlantic, 320 miles southwest of Iceland. 11:47 p.m. Commander Frederick Johnny Walker stood on the bridge of his sloop, staring at the green glow of the Type 271 radar screen with something approaching religious devotion. The night was pitch black, heavy cloud cover, no moon, visibility near zero, but on that glowing screen, he could see everything. The 5 other ships of his escort group appeared as bright blips, each labeled with its call sign. The merchantmen they were protecting showed as larger returns, scattered across 3 miles of ocean in a staggered formation. And there, at the edge of the screen's range, a contact that didn't belong. Surface contact, bearing 270, range 4,200 yards. The radar operator called out, his voice steady despite the significance of what he was reporting. Moving left to right. Speed approximately 12 knots. It's small, sir. Very small. Walker felt his pulse quicken. Small and moving fast meant only one thing: a U-boat on the surface, running on diesel engines to recharge its batteries. 3 years ago, that U-boat would have been invisible, undetectable, safe in the darkness while it maneuvered for an attack on the convoy. But 3 years ago, British escorts didn't carry centimetric radar. "Sound action stations," Walker ordered quietly. "All ahead full. Helm, come left to 270. Signal Wild Goose and Woodpecker, we have a surface contact, am engaging." Starling's engines roared to life, her modified hull cutting through the Atlantic swells at 20 knots. Walker had fought U-boats the old way, the blind way, during the dark years of 1940 and 1941, when every convoy crossing was a desperate gamble against an invisible enemy. He remembered the frustration of knowing a U-boat was out there somewhere, hunting, while his primitive radar painted nothing but sea clutter and false returns. He remembered rolling depth charges into empty ocean, hoping for a miracle. This was different. This was hunting with eyes that could see in the dark. "Range closing, 3,800 yards, the operator reported. "Target is steady on course. No indication he's detected us, sir." Of course the U-boat hadn't detected them. The German submarines carried radar detectors that could pick up the meter-wavelength transmissions from older British radar sets, giving them warning when a patrol aircraft or escort ship was nearby. But the Type 271 radar that Starling carried built around an American-made cavity magnetron, mass-produced at Western Electric's factory in New Jersey, transmitted on a wavelength of just 10 centimeters. The U-boat's detectors were deaf to it. The submarine commander had no idea death was racing toward him through the darkness at 20 knots. "Range 2,000 yards. He's still on the surface, sir." Walker could imagine the scene on that U-boat's bridge, the commander scanning the darkness with binoculars, his lookouts straining to see the convoy, all of them confident in the protective cover of night. Perhaps they were discussing their attack plan, choosing which merchantman to target first. Perhaps the torpedo crews were already at their stations, ready to launch. Searchlight crews, stand ready. Starshell ready on the forward gun. Range 1,200 yards now. The 4-inch gun barked, and a starshell burst high above the target zone, its parachute flare igniting to cast harsh white light across a circle of ocean. And there it was, caught like a rabbit in lamplight, a Type vs U-boat, grey-painted and sleek, her conning tower bristling with lookouts who were only just now realizing their danger. Starling's searchlights blazed to life, pinning the U-boat in overlapping beams of white light. Walker could see men scrambling on the conning tower, could see the submarine beginning its emergency dive, her bow dropping as she tried to claw her way down to safety. But she was too late. Starling was already on top of her. "Fire!" Walker commanded. The forward gun spoke again, its shell screaming across the narrowing gap to explode against the U-boat's pressure hull just abaft the conning tower. A gout of flame erupted, and pieces of metal spun away into the darkness. The submarine's dive became a death spiral, her stern rising as her damaged bow pulled her down. Depth charges ready. Set for shallow pattern, 50 feet. Starling roared over the swirl of white water that marked where the submarine had gone down, her stern racks releasing a pattern of depth charges that tumbled into the sea. Walker counted silently 8, 9, 10, and then the ocean erupted in massive plumes of white water as 300 pounds of amatol exploded in the depths, the shock waves radiating outward to crush U-boat hulls and kill men who never knew what hit them. "Aztec contact lost in the turbulence, sir." "Wait. I'm picking up breaking up noises. Metallic sounds. She's going down." Walker nodded, allowing himself a moment of grim satisfaction. One less U-boat. One less threat to the lifeline that kept Britain alive. And it had taken less than 10 minutes from detection to destruction, all because of a copper cylinder invented by 2 young physicists in Birmingham and mass-produced by American industry. 3 years ago, that U-boat would have torpedoed 2, maybe 3 ships before anyone knew it was there. Tonight, it was on its way to the bottom of the Atlantic, and the convoy would reach Liverpool intact. May 3, 1943. 18,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley, Germany. 1:23 a.m. Flight Lieutenant James Stokes guided his Beaufighter night fighter through the darkness, his eyes flicking between his instruments and the sky ahead, seeing nothing. Below, the industrial heart of Germany sprawled in the darkness: factories, rail yards, power stations, all hidden under blackout conditions. And somewhere up here, invisible in the night, a German bomber was heading home after dropping its payload on Manchester. "I've got something," his radar operator, Sergeant Harry Mills, announced from the cramped compartment behind Stokes. Mills sat hunched over the AI Mark 8 radar scope, watching the green trace paint a picture of the sky that Stokes couldn't see with his eyes. "Bearing 185, range 3,000 yards, slightly above us. Could be our bomber." Stokes turned the Beaufighter gently, bringing the nose around to the indicated bearing. The night fighter was equipped with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, enough firepower to shred any bomber ever built, but those weapons were useless if you couldn't find the target. Before centimetric radar, night fighter crews had relied on searchlights, ground-controlled interception, and sheer luck. Most sorties ended without ever seeing the enemy. Range 2,500 yards. Steady bearing. His flying straight and level, probably thinks he's safe now that he's over Germany. "Keep talking to me, Harry," Stokes said, adding power to close the distance. The Beaufighter's twin engines roared louder, pushing the heavy fighter through the thin air at 240 miles per hour. Range 2,000 yards. Bearing steady. Height is about 500 feet above us. You'll need to climb slightly. Range 1,500 yards. Stokes pulled back gently on the stick, watching his altimeter wind upward. The AI Mark 8 radar, built around an American-made magnetron and installed in British night fighters starting in early 1943, could detect aircraft at ranges up to 5 miles and track them all the way into visual range. It was the culmination of everything the RAD lab had learned from the original British cavity magnetron: smaller, more reliable, more powerful. Range 1,000 yards. Dead ahead. You should have visual in about 10 seconds. Stokes strained his eyes, scanning the darkness ahead. They're a slightly darker shape against the black sky, the silhouette of an aircraft. Twin engines, a long fuselage, a twin tail. Dornier Do 217. He identified it immediately. German medium bomber, crew of 4, capable of carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs. Probably just finished dropping them on British civilians. "I have visual," Stokes reported quietly. "Harry, good work. Stand by." He closed to 400 yards, matching the bomber's speed and altitude, sliding into position directly behind and below the dead zone where the Dornier's defensive guns couldn't reach. The German crew had no idea he was there. They were probably discussing their bombing run, congratulating themselves on their accuracy, thinking about breakfast when they landed. Stokes thumbed the trigger, and his 4 20mm cannons erupted in a devastating burst of fire. Explosive shells walked up the Dornier's fuselage from tail to cockpit, ripping through aluminum skin and destroying everything inside. The bomber's port engine exploded in flames. Its wing folded upward at an impossible angle. And then it was tumbling, spinning, burning, falling the long 3 miles to the German countryside below. Stokes didn't watch it fall. He was already scanning the darkness for the next target, knowing that where there was one bomber, there might be others. "Nice shooting, Skipper," Mills said from behind him. "That's 4 this month. The squadron record is 6. We might actually get it." Stokes grinned despite himself. 4 confirmed kills in a month. It would have been impossible 2 years ago, when night fighters flew blind and collisions with friendly aircraft were more common than successful intercepts. But now, with centimetric radar painting the sky in precise detail, the Luftwaffe's bombers were being hunted with systematic efficiency. The once devastating night raids on British cities were becoming suicide missions as more and more fighters carried AI Mark 8 radar. "Let's make it 5, Stokes said, banking the Beaufighter back toward the bomber stream. "Harry, keep that scope warm. We've got work to do." July 19, 1943. USS Bogue, Central Atlantic. 2:35 p.m. Lieutenant Commander William Drain stood on the flight deck of the escort carrier, watching his Avenger torpedo bomber waddle down the deck and lumber into the sky. Strapped into that Avenger's belly was an ASV Mark III radar set, another product of American mass production and British innovation, capable of detecting a submarine's conning tower at 10 miles in daylight, 15 miles at night. The Bogue was hunting U-boats in the mid-Atlantic Gap, that deadly stretch of ocean too far from land for conventional patrol aircraft to reach. For 3 years, the Gap had been a slaughterhouse, where U-boats operated with near impunity against convoys beyond the range of air cover. But escort carriers like Bogue had closed the gap, bringing aircraft into the heart of the hunting ground. And those aircraft carried radar that made submarines visible from the sky. Drain watched his Avenger circle once, then head west on its patrol pattern. For other aircraft were already airborne, creating an interlocking search pattern that covered hundreds of square miles of ocean. Below, a convoy of 40 merchantmen plodded eastward toward Britain, their precious cargo of food, fuel, and ammunition desperately needed to keep the war effort alive. Flight operations, this is Blue 3. The radio crackled to life. I have a radar contact, bearing 285 from Point Roger, range 12 miles. Contact is stationary, might be a U-boat on the surface. Drain grabbed the handset. Blue 3, this is Control. Investigate but do not attack until visual confirmation. Vector Blue 4 to support. Over. Blue 3, Roger. Coming around to investigate. Drain moved to the plotting table where the air operations officer was already marking the contact on a large chart of the patrol area. 12 miles from the convoy's projected track, close enough to be a threat, far enough that the U-boat might not have spotted the convoy yet. Sir, Blue 3 reports visual confirmation, the radio operator called out. Type IXC U-boat, fully surfaced, appears to be charging batteries. Blue 3 is attacking. On the plotting table, the drama played out in dry notation and moving markers. Blue 3 dove from 4,000 feet, its pilot releasing 4 depth bombs that walked across the U-boat's position. The submarine, caught by surprise, began its emergency dive but took at least one direct hit. Oil and debris surfaced. Blue 4 arrived and dropped additional depth bombs into the swirl. An hour later, a massive oil slick and floating wreckage confirmed the kill. It was Bogue's 9th U-boat since joining the Atlantic battle in March. Across the Atlantic, other escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft equipped with centimetric radar were achieving similar results. The U-boats were being hunted faster than Germany could build them. Admiral Donitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, was pulling his boats back from the Atlantic, admitting defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic for the first time since the war began. The tide had turned. And it had turned because of a technology that Britain had invented and America had manufactured. November 15, 1943. Radiation Laboratory, MIT, Building 20. 4:45 p.m. Eddie Bowen sat in Lee Dubridge's office, reviewing the latest production figures from the RAD Labs liaison with Western Electric. The numbers were staggering. In the 3 years since the Tizard mission, American industry had produced over 100,000 cavity magnetrons. Those magnetrons had been built into thousands of radar sets: shipboard search radars, airborne intercept radars, anti-submarine warfare radars, ground-based early warning radars, gun-laying radars for anti-aircraft batteries. The little copper cylinder that he had carried across the Atlantic in a black box, handcuffed to his wrist, terrified of losing it to a U-boat attack, had been replicated, refined, and mass-produced on a scale that Britain could never have achieved alone. We've completely redesigned the original magnetron 6 times, Dubridge said, joining Bowen at the table. Made it smaller, more powerful, more reliable. We've created variants for every wavelength from 3 centimeters to 25 centimeters. We've optimized the manufacturing process so that Western Electric can produce 500 units per day. And you know the funny thing. What's that? Bowen asked. We still display the original unit number 12, the one you brought over in the main laboratory. Every new scientist who joins the RAD lab sees it on their first day. We tell them the story of how it arrived, how close it came to ending up on the ocean floor. It reminds them what they're working for. Bowen smiled faintly. Randall and Boot would be embarrassed by all the attention. They just wanted to solve a physics problem. They solved more than a physics problem, Dubridge said seriously. They gave us a weapon that's killing U-boats, shooting down bombers, protecting our ships, guiding our aircraft. The war's not over yet, but when it is, historians are going to look back and identify the cavity magnetron as one of the decisive technologies. Right up there with the atomic bomb, possibly more important in terms of lives saved and battles won. Britain couldn't have done this alone, Bowen acknowledged. We had the invention, but you had the industrial capacity to turn it into a weapon system. Tizard was right to bring it here. And Churchill was right to approve the mission, Dubridge added. I know there were people in London who thought he was crazy, giving away Britain's most valuable secret to a neutral country. But it was exactly the right decision. Britain got American manufacturing capacity. America got a 3-year head start on radar technology. And together, we're winning the war. Through the window, Bowen could see scientists and engineers moving through Building 20, working at desks crowded into every available space, bent over oscilloscopes and prototype radar sets, arguing about circuit designs and antenna patterns. The temporary wooden building had become the beating heart of Allied radar development, employing 4,000 people and operating on a budget that exceeded $100 million. And it had all started with a gift freely given, because Britain had no choice but to trust America with its most precious secret. May 8, 1945. London. VE Day. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. In the streets of London, crowds celebrated with a joy born of 6 years of suffering finally ended. Churchill addressed the nation from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Air raid sirens silent these past months would never sound again over British cities. In a quiet office in the Ministry of Defence, Henry Tizard read the final reports on radar's contribution to Allied victory. The statistics were overwhelming. Over 90% of U-boats destroyed in 1943 to 1945 were detected first by centimetric radar. Night fighter interceptions increased 800% after the introduction of AI radar. Convoy losses dropped from 25% in 1942 to less than 1% in 1944. Not a single V-1 flying bomb got through radar-directed anti-aircraft fire once the system was fully deployed. The cavity magnetron had done exactly what Tizard had promised it would do. It had helped win the war. But more than that, it had forged a bond between British science and American industry that would outlast the war itself. The RAD lab would eventually close, but its scientists would go on to create the American electronics industry, founding companies and research laboratories that would dominate the post-war world. The principles learned from radar development would lead to microwave communications, satellite technology, medical imaging, even the microwave oven in every kitchen. And none of it would have happened without 2 young physicists who didn't know something was impossible, and a nation brave enough to give away its most valuable secret to an ally it hoped would become a friend. Tizard locked the reports in his safe and walked to the window, looking out at the celebrating crowds. Somewhere in that crowd, perhaps, were merchant sailors who had survived convoy crossings they shouldn't have survived, fighter pilots who had shot down bombers they shouldn't have been able to find, families whose homes hadn't been destroyed because radar-directed guns had stopped the bombs before they fell. They would never know about the cavity magnetron, never understand how a copper cylinder had saved their lives. But Tizard knew. And that was enough.